Hi, fellow geochemists and geochemistry enthusiasts. Welcome to Geochemist Tea, the only podcast for people who love geochemistry with a side of tea. Our mission is to inspire future geochemists and to introduce our listeners to niche geochemistry topics. I'm your host, Sam Scher, and this month we are bringing back our friend of the show, Simon Griffiths, to add on to our library of applications of geochemistry data to ore deposits, this time talking about the applications of geochemistry in greenstone gold exploration. Simon Griffiths is the principal consultant at Third Planet Exploration Services. Simon, welcome back to Geochemistry.
Hi, Sam. Thanks for having me back yet again.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. Everybody, he's making a face at me.
No screenshots this time, please.
No screenshot, I promise. I'll take a professional one. So, Simon, you have two of our most popular shows thus far. Arguably, people already know who you are or could easily find out. So I figured instead of this time just rehashing your entire life journey to help those that need to be mentored, I figured this time it would be interesting if you could tell something a little bit more niche in your geochemistry career that could also probably inspire some people out there.
Yeah, sure, Sam. Yeah, I guess when I left Barrick Explorations, I've been working with them for 10 or 12 years or so, something like that. And I'd been working about the same amount of time previous to that with Kennecott or Rio Tinto. And then, of course, you know my story, so it was a few years before that in Mexico as well. But so really after being basically almost 30 years working in large companies, I thought, why don't I try my hand at the consulting game? And it was something that I had in the back of my mind probably for about 5 or so years before I actually left Barrick. And yeah, the conditions were right at that point in my life and that point in my career. I thought, look, I've got a big network of people. I've met a lot and worked with a lot of great people around the world. There are lots and lots of ex-Rio Tinto people, lots and lots of ex-Barrick people my age, roughly, and working and basically running projects and sometimes running companies, mid-sized companies, junior companies. Some of them are still in the majors. And I thought, I've got this network. There'll be interesting projects that they're all working on, so let's just have a go. And one of the big things too is that then it allows you to focus on, or allows me now to focus on, the things I like doing. So I guess as you move through the levels in a large company, you obviously, if you're starting to have more responsibilities and have more complex roles, you spend less and less time with your hands on the tools. And so the one good thing about consulting and basically just being a very small company is that I can keep my hands on the tools, keep up to speed with the sort of the new techniques that are coming out and try and develop a few new tools of my own. And yeah, just basically spend a lot more time on the technical side of things.
I love that. One thing, though, that I just wanted to mention that I find really interesting, particularly about your consultancy, is that for the entire time that you have been working, I've noticed that you've worked with a lot of younger geologists. And I think I'm just interested, how have you found them or have they found you? Do you think that this is an interesting path to pursue for somebody coming out of university? Really, though, just keeping in mind that postings by major and mid-tier mining companies at this time really still require 10 years of experience in geochemistry in order to apply, which younger geologists, geochemists might not have, but they still want a shot at just trying to be a geochemist. What do you think about that?
Yes, well, you might not believe it, but I do still remember when I first started out in the industry, even though it was
Shocking.
several decades ago. Yeah. But yeah, it's tough. And it was tough back in the day for everyone. Everyone kind of needs a break. I think if someone is out there looking and is being proactive and is really interested in mineral exploration, then it's a little bit on us as the sort of almost the sort of the outgoing generation to try do all we can to bring on the new talent and get them exposed to things. Now, the other thing is once I actually did start working, at the time there weren't these great big sort of HR-driven mentoring programs that there are now, and there were by the end of the time that I was at Barrick. But I did have mentors, and older geologists will take you under their wing. They'll take you when you're in the field. They'll show you things very tacit things that they've learned over the years from their own experience and their own mentors back in when they were younger. So I think there's a certain amount, I feel anyway, a certain amount of responsibility to try and pass on as much as I can to the younger generation. It's a win situation. If someone can help me out, I'm learning from them as well. People coming out with new ideas and new techniques from the universities, and I can show them some of the older tricks of the trade, as it were.
I think that's a really good point, and that's really cool. So I guess what you're saying is that everybody should just hand you a resume. You're ready. Just gonna hire all the
The,
students that want you.
not to sound like so much of a huge plug or anything, but the thing is with, of course, geochemistry, and of course, I guess we're preaching to the choir here anyway because
Mm.
of the name of the channel, the podcast. But yeah, geochemistry really is the way we are taught to categorize rocks, and especially all of the metamorphic and igneous rocks were based on their mineralogy, which comes down to the chemistry. And even looking at mineral fluids and mineral chemistry, mostly a lot of it comes into the geochemistry field. I know that when you spend a lot of time doing or focused on a particular subject, you start to tend to see it everywhere. But I see geochemistry pretty much everywhere in geology and in an awful lot of what we do as mineral explorationists. And it goes right through to metallurgy, geometallurgy, and all the way through the system.
Such a good point.
Mm.
Look, as I mentioned, you've been on the show now third time, and we thank you for it. We love every time you've come on, but I just wanted to remind you that does not exclude you from tea time. So I hope that you brought a good story. Kettle Pot, let's hear it.
Okay, I was thinking about the other tea that's been spilt on our sessions, Sam, and I thought I'd try and have a tea story from basically a district or a region that hosts the type of mineral deposits we're going to talk about.
Oh boy.
And so I've had one from North America in the Carlin, I had one from South America in the Andes. So I thought tell one today from the Lake Victoria Goldfields, so in Tanzania. So we're on the African continent. So I go out to visit one of the projects there, big mine, I might as well name it Bulyanhulu. So it's in Lake Victoria Goldfields, not all that far from Lake Victoria itself, in northwestern Tanzania. Anyhow, on the way back, of course, it's fly in, fly out. On the way out, the normal larger plane is getting serviced, so we're on a smaller plane. And we have to stop to refuel at this little town called Mwanza. It's right on the lakeshore. So, of course, the way it's a smaller plane, there's about 10 or 12 of us on this plane. We all have to get off and we go into this little adobe hut, which is the airport facility, whilst the plane's getting refueled. Now, I'm getting a little bit anxious about this because this is a non-scheduled stop in terms of like on the actual timetable. And I have an Emirates flight back to Perth through with a fairly tight now connection with this refueling stop. So I'm telling the pilot, can we just board the plane as soon as they're finished refueling? Can we not mess about? Can you try and corral everyone back onto the plane as quickly as possible? And so yeah, I can see you're a bit anxious. And so anyway, the refueling stopped and he comes in and it's quickly get everyone on the plane, get up in the air and take off. So after about half an hour, we're flying across the Serengeti, and we're actually flying over the Serengeti. I'm not making this up. And the pilot comes back to where the passengers are and closes the cockpit door, and he says, and he's got this clipboard with a piece of paper on it, and he's looking at the clipboard, he's looking around the room kind of thing. And he says, I think we left someone behind in Mwanza. He said, we have to decide whether to go back for them or go straight to Dar es Salaam, which is the capital of Tanzania. Of course, I'm thinking, oh man, I've missed my connection now. I'm obviously going to overnight in Dar es Salaam now. I'm missing all my other connections and everything. But I didn't want to say anything because you've left some poor guy back in the middle of nowhere without his luggage
Have a
or
heart.
anything in this little adobe hut. Anyhow, as I'm pondering what to do or say, there's a great big lady sitting right behind me, and she stands up and she just basically almost envelops me as she leans over these tiny seats and shouts to this poor little pilot, straight to Dar. So he goes back into the cockpit, shuts the door like petrified. And all this time we've been going in circles because the pilot doesn't know where we're going to go. And so we're all disorientated. So then we start flying in a straight line again. And I don't know if we're flying east, west, north, south. If we're going to Dar, we're going back to Mwanza.
Mm.
Anyway, after about 20 or 30 minutes, I thought, we're not descending. We must be going, we must be going east. We must be heading back to Dar. And we did. So we left some poor bloke out in the middle of nowhere with no luggage
Oh
and
my.
just to fend for himself.
It's not funny, but
I
funny.
know. So now, even today, this was like, I don't know, 15 or something. It was about 2010 or something, 15 or something years ago. And even now, if someone has to make a decision really quickly, I just think in my head, straight to Dar. It's just a little anthem I got going.
I think that's actually a great anthem. I might also now think about that. Imagery vivid. That was great, T. Big thanks. Oh my God. Yeah, that I've also been to that, like all those different areas, but on a university trip. And I feel like I have the exact imagery needed for this story. So we'll talk about me and another lady later when we cut the recording.
Yeah. Actually, the sequel to that is, probably don't have time for this in the show, but when we actually arrived at the Dar es Salaam airport, the pilot came back to me and said, okay, we're taxiing, but the Emirates plane is just over there. I can just taxi right up to the Emirates, like
Of course.
A380, and you can get on. I said, no, I'll go through the security and the normal channels. Thank you very much. I'll take my chances. Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, run
that's
across
perfect.
the tarmac at the international airport.
Right.
Mm.
Why can't you back taxi? Oh, because we have a little Cessna blocking our way.
Oh, and there's someone trying to board our plane from it. Yeah,
Oh my God.
harmless.
Wow.
Mm.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I need a sip of water, then we can continue.
Mhm.
Okay. So for this episode, Simon and I both talked at length multiple times about personal drama and then what to talk about for the show. Neither of us, I just want to repeat, neither of us is an expert in fluid chemistry of greenstone golds. If that, we're going to have to get Craig Hart, Rich Goldfarb. I'm going to have to do heavier lifting to get some people on the show if people really want to hear more about the geochemistry of the fluids. That said, I think what we're going to talk about today is still really pertinent and really interesting, and it goes along with the themes that we talked about in previous episodes with Simon. For this episode, we decided to read Archean Low Gold Deposits in Ontario by Colvine et al., or as it's colloquially known as, the Greenstone Bible. How does one attack this 156-page document?
Yes, and the other thing about this tome is that it was first published in 1984, which is actually 40 years ago. So I've got in my notes 40 years on Archean low gold deposits in Ontario. Yeah, and is it still pertinent, and how do we use it? I think the first thing was, like a lot of other things in life, really, obviously just break it down into smaller pieces, bite-sized chunks, as they say. Just on a sort of first pass, you got part one is talking about depositional model. And there's all sorts of very interesting and actually that's for me anyway, where a lot of the useful, like, things that you can apply in the field come. And then the second part, it talks about a genetic model. And I think with the genetic model side of things, there's been obviously an awful lot more research in the last 40 years by some of the workers you just mentioned, and a lot of others that have added to the genetic model side of things. But in terms of the depositional model, I think for me, that's a lot more kind of field geological, if you like. And that's really what I still take around with me when I'm doing my exploration for orogenic deposits or Archean type low gold deposits.
Yeah, and I know for me, like when I first encountered this tome, as you say, I was working in hyperspectral, and for me, it was really important to break down properly the alteration and what that was, because I had never really, outside of university, been in the field with a greenstone gold deposit at that time. So I had to create basically a summary for clients so that they could understand, oh, we're seeing this change in chemistry, we're seeing this assemblage. So for me, it was like, okay, I have to focus in on the alterations, and the alteration that tome is extensive.
Yeah.
But something also cool that I found in there, and I've always been fascinated by, is all the chemical reactions, and I found that incredibly helpful as well. And then who doesn't like a little bit of a discussion about fluids and everything? They had their gold plus
Absolutely.
this and everything. Yeah.
Yeah. No, yeah, 100%. That for that part one, there's an introductory chapter specific that's much more specific to Superior Province and the Ontario deposits or settings. But then they get straight into the structural setting, which is a pretty large section. And then they get, as you say, straight then next on to the systematics of rock alteration. And then there's a lot of really useful like discussion in there. And then they just keep going then. So with specific environments, like talk about association with felsic intrusives, timing, which now we regard as dynamics, timing of mineralization, and then a little bit about depositional model itself and the evidence for fluid type. And then that kind of segues into the genetic model, the second part of the publication. So I really like the way it's organized at the beginning. And as a matter of fact, well, that first part, the sort of systematic mineral systems and prospectivity analysis approach that some of the larger companies are now using, they pretty much follow those sections. If you think about the way people evaluate, if you've listened to some of the talks at some of the recent conferences this year, especially people say the structural setting. These are the key manifestations of the key elements in structural setting for such a deposit, and then cycle through the other things like the lithologies, lithological setting, the alteration, and things like that. So I think this is a very good guide and very well set out in terms of the way we logically go through exploration process and evaluation of projects.
And really, then, as a follow up to this question, what I had written was, does it still help with greenstone prospectivity and is it relevant? And I think based on what you're saying,
Yeah,
oh,
absolutely. Absolutely, I think it does. And one of the things when you're working with a large company, so I'm going to just pull back on or mention my experience there in Barrick, because we had a very strong technical group, a group of technical specialists that was on a global level, but then also had the regional teams, regional being continent scale teams. And this technical team was led by Francois Robert out of Montreal. And the thing with Francois is he's one of these Goldfarb sort of people who researcher, did his PhD back in the day in the Abitibi, worked in as a researcher and did a lot of research in university, wrote loads and loads of papers for, I think, first 12 or so years of his career, and then came into mineral exploration. And so we had him as a resource, for example, in the group. Now, back to a little bit the point about young people coming out of university and how on earth would they get exposed to or any airtime at all with someone like that, or even someone like virtually any of the members of these big technical groups in the large companies. And one of the ways of doing it is, apart from working with someone like me, and getting a little bit of my tacit knowledge. No, but the way this Greenstone Bible is laid out, I think is a really good way of getting into keynote gold exploration. And it is, like I said, laid out very logically, and there's a lot of detail in there. And it basically mirrors, I think, the approach that a lot of or the larger companies are using, the ones who are looking for these types of deposits. And incidentally, even though most of my consulting is basically relying on or falling back on my experience as a geochemist, I was also chief geologist in South America for Barrick for a couple of years, and basically running this system as it was applied back then in Barrick. And I have had a lot of requests over the last probably 18 months to 2 years from people to help them build systems like it. And if they're looking for orogenic deposits or greenstone deposits, it, don't have to plagiarize anything from Barrick or breach any agreements you might have with them, because it's laid out in something like this paper or this publication, this book.
yeah, no, totally. And I would say as a follow up too, that we're talking about mentors, mentees. I remember being completely flummoxed by the presence of this one mineral in this hyperspectral data set that I saw. I was like, why is there prehnite in a porphyry environment in Mexico? So very young, not very metamorphosed. Why is this here? And then I had read of it being in Highland Valley. And
Mm.
I contacted the author of the paper, and that person was thrilled to talk about his PhD with me for well over an hour. So it's doing things like this, looking through the literature. And
Yeah,
a lot of times when you get to people who has spent years of their life researching something, a lot of times they're very happy to take an hour of their time and talk to you about it. So maybe even like at that very small level, you can get that too.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Not everybody can get a Simon Griffiths or a Francois Robert, but sometimes we can get.
Like if you don't reach out to people, then they can't even have a chance to say no.
There
But
you go.
yeah, I think a lot of people, again, obviously, we all go through times when these are pressure points where we got some time constraints and we're genuinely very busy with some deadlines and stuff. I do find that people, generally speaking, are willing to share, and that's another advantage of going to conferences, technical conferences, and everything, because people will just chat with you over a beer or over a coffee or a wine or something during the break, as well as, of course, their actual formal presentations or the posters.
Yeah. And in the case of my presentation coming up at the IAGS conference in Adelaide, I'm giving it solely so that I can ask the room what their feedback is and if they have any other better ideas.
Oh, great. I'll be
Yeah,
sitting in the front row.
me.
Yeah, pick me. Yeah.
Oh my. So getting back to greenstones, though,
Mm.
I think this is a great diversion. But getting back to greenstones, I think it would just be just some flavor for us. You don't have to name all the deposits specifically, but how many different belts and maybe which different greenstone belts have you worked in so far?
Yeah, again, working with Barrick, of course. And it was the same with Rio Tinto, except for they're not looking for greenstone gold, or at least they weren't for the whole time I was working for them. But it was the same for Rio Tinto insofar as in the porphyries and the kimberlites and the other deposits they're looking for. But with Barrick, you get exposed and you manage to spend time where you can, if you're in a technical role anyway, spend time on real household name deposits, real tier one world class deposits and in their districts, because sometimes you're helping out with the brownfields exploration and sometimes you're helping out with the greenfields, supporting the greenfields exploration. So as with Barrick, it meant that it was able to work on deposits in, as I mentioned, the Lake Victoria goldfields in Tanzania and East Africa, but also in the Abitibi in Ontario. And of course, I was based in Western Australia for a while. So of course, the Western Australian, so the Yilgarn deposits, but then since I've been consulting, as I mentioned, some other ex-Barrick and ex-Rio people working in different places now. And so I've also been able to work actually quite extensively on the Fennoscandian Shield, especially in Finland, but a little bit in Sweden as well. And then in the Birimian Shield in West Africa, so Ghana, Ivory Coast, and other countries in West Africa and even in one of the terrains, the accreted terrains on in the southeast part of Alaska, just across from Greens Creek or Juneau, Alaska. There's near Juneau, Alaska. There's a deposit called Kensington, and it is generally, I think, still regarded as a greenstone deposit. And actually, Greens Creek itself might be, or a deformed VMS. But yeah, so that's probably 5 or 6 of the shield areas or greenstone belts around the world that been lucky enough to be out in the field on all of them basically as well. So
Have
get some
you
field time.
have you noticed any like major differences or are they more or less the
Mm.
same?
No, there are major differences, and I think essentially the biggest sort of high level differences I would say is that some of the belts are basically dominated by volcanic rocks, submarine volcanic rocks, basically pillow basalts and things like that, and sometimes even ultramafic rocks, with a small amount of metasediments. And then other belts are almost completely dominated by metasedimentary rocks with only a much more minor input of the volcanics, or the metavolcanics now. So I think from a lithological perspective, if you've got a large volume of rock that's predominantly basically from marine sediments or predominantly from mafic volcanics or intermediate to mafic volcanics, then it just sets you off in a little bit of a different direction when it comes to fluid rock interactions and therefore alteration. and then the minerals that are associated with the gold mineralization. So notwithstanding the depth that these various districts have been buried to, whereas or if the deposits were formed in a sort of around the sort of 5 kilometer depth or around the sort of 10 or more kilometer depth, as some of the other literature now will talk about, you know, epizonal being at about 5 to 8 kilometers. They'll talk about mesozonal being 7 to 12 kilometers and hypozonal deposits being formed at 10 to 15 kilometers depth. Now, of course, that plus the actual source fluids will affect as well, clearly, the type of alteration, the type of mineralization, including the sulfide species and whatnot that you'll have. But obviously as well, the package of the general composition, if you like, or the dominant compositions of the packages of rocks that these fluids come into and the depths that they're formed out will have a big influence. So I think you can have a big matrix table where you take, okay, do I have a lot of phyllites, or do I have a lot of carbonates, or do I have evaporites? And as a sedimentary package, is that more dominant or less dominant than the volcanics? And in the volcanics, is it basically just a lot of basalts? Are there ultramafic rocks in there as well? Are there more or are there slightly more intermediate rocks in there as well? And what's the overall sort of makeup? So I've seen how those general big picture or high level things do vary from belt to belt.
Yeah, that's super cool. And something to note about the Greenstone Bible is that it has some of those cool matrices in it. Plus, it has some really neat written out reactions of depending if you're in a felsic environment, like a metaseds, a basaltic, ultramafic, and what you would see in some of the alteration mineralogy in there. If you like reactions, there you go. Thinking about the context of gold globally, why are these deposits so important? Why are we exploring for them?
Yeah, so the exploration for these deposits, again, even starting with this Greenstone Bible 40 years ago, and then all of the other research and publications that are built on top of it, these are, even though they're very complex, these deposits are highly researched and the publications are out there. And there are a lot of people who've spent a lot of expertise and field experience looking for them. So they're relatively well known, and the models on how they were formed and the types of alteration that you might find in certain environments are fairly well known and documented. Nothing's easy to explore for. I suppose everything's easy to explore for. It's finding it is the hard part. But so it's a well-known deposit style, if you like, even though it's quite a broad one and complex. So you've got that. So you've got information on your side. But the main reason then is what you do when you find something. If you look at the orogenic deposits or the greenstone deposits and you stack them up in terms of tonnage and grade, you stack them up to the other mineral or gold deposit types around the world, and really they're right up there in the upper echelons. If you think about where gold endowment, the amount of gold that humanity has produced over the years, it's come either from the Wits Basin, or it's come from the Carlin trends, or it's come from orogenic gold. Orogenic gold is right up there on the podium, I would say, in the sort of top three in terms of the ounces or tonnages of gold produced. The other thing is that one of the phrases, as we used to talk about as well, is the quality of ounces. So the greenstone deposits also up there in terms of their normal or what you expect as an average grade from the deposit. So for example, the Carlin deposits are in the several grams per ton to maybe quarter ounce, 5-6 gram per ton sort of range. The greenstone deposits would be in not far behind. The average grades, if you've got cutoff grades in the 1 to 3 grams per ton, you could reasonably expect the average grades to be in the 3 to 5 grams per ton sort of range. Now you contrast that with epithermal deposits, like the high sulfidation deposits that we spoke of last time. Some of the mines that were operating while I was working with Barrick, they're producing 500,000 to 1 million ounces of gold per year, and their average grade is 0.2 grams per ton, or their cutoff is 0.2 and their average grade is point or something like that. And so these are important deposits. The orogenic deposits are very important in terms of their profitability, okay? And the amount of endowment and the amount of gold that has been produced from them historically and will likely be produced from them going forward.
That's super interesting. Pivoting this now back to geochemistry, because that's what we're trying to do here.
Yeah.
How do we explore for them in a geochemical context?
Yeah, so in the geochemical context, and I'm going to keep to dovetailing back and forth with this whole exploration sort of system approach as well. So if you think about, you have your area selections, you're working at a regional scale, then you have your sort of camp selection, so then you're honing in on a much smaller scale, and then you're doing your target delineation and target generation on an even smaller scale. There's lots of literature now as well around the whole concept of this mineral systems approach and prospectivity analysis. And essentially, one of the main kind of one of the main concepts in all of this approach is when you're looking on a regional area selection basis, you're interested in predicting where the best belts might be within, or where the best sort of trends or shear zones and things or structures and things might be in a much more regional context. So that's your area selection. It's predictive. Once you have got yourself into a district that you like, or a belt that you like, then you focus in on the camp or district scale. And now what you're trying to do is detect. You're trying to find now something, detect something in that sort of smaller area. So what you do, you go from prediction to detection. And that is one of those phrases that you'll probably hear about if you go to conferences and read articles on the mineral systems approach and prospectivity analysis. Now, from a geochemical perspective, then of course that changes the sorts of tools that you'll be using, and then of course the layers, if you like, that you're going to be using in the GIS or in your data compilation at the different scales. So on a predictive level, you'll be looking for signs of endowment. Of course, if you're looking at mineral occurrences, databases, or if there are some sort of international or governmental geochem surveys, so you might have regional stream sediment samples or regional lake sediment sampling that's been done either by the country's government or by some international organization. And so those are the tools you're using to try and infer or predict where you might find some endowment. When you get to the detection level, then you change tact, you change your sort of toolkit, and that's when you're going in and looking or collecting, depending on the amount of exposure that's there or cover that's there, soil sampling, rock chip grids, and other type, and then even getting into sort of mineral chemistry and things like that to vector into to a deposit or a drill target. Essentially, again, flipping back to the larger scale, you can use the geochem. Again, some people will ask, where does my geochem layer go in this whole sort of stacked and scaled exploration scheme? If you think about it, you're just being a detective and you're just trying to find any evidence of either the endowment or the mineralization or alteration. So of course, the geochemistry can slot in pretty much anywhere. So if you're on a regional scale and you've got big, widely spaced surveys, you might be looking at the types of rocks, the types of lithologies that might be present. Do the greenstone belts or the basins, do they have what's more primitive rocks? So are the basalts, for example, tholeiitic? Is there geochemical evidence for that? Are they more komatiitic type ultramafic rocks? So are they more magnesium-rich mafic volcanics? Are they more iron-rich mafic volcanics, or are they more calcium-rich mafic volcanics? And then when you get into a smaller scale, you might use the geochemistry then to try and predict if there's any evidence of big alteration trends. So, for example, in some of these belts, you might see huge sort of corridors of albertization, for example, or huge corridors of iron carbonate, anchorite alteration, as well as the chlorite or even calcite sometimes as well. You can obviously use the geochemistry ratios, look at alteration indices and things like that, and then plot those spatially. And so then the geochemistry is contributing to fertility prediction on a sort of regional basis, can also help predict where you might find these alteration corridors, and so which are the hot structures, which orientations of the major structures might be the ones that have brought a lot of fluids in. And then clearly on the detection scale, then you start looking at again the alteration, but start looking more at maybe direct gold anomalies or pathfinder elements that you'd expect to find in the various other minerals that would be associated with the gold mineralization,
And
such
I think
as sulfides. Sorry to sort of cut you there, but just what kind of sulfides might you be expecting to find in the area?
Yeah, and I think that's so interesting that you mentioned, because usually when people just for the curious, they'll just ask, what's the suite of elements that you generally use when you're looking for a specific type of deposit? Usually that suite is based upon, as you mentioned, the sulfides and what are the pathfinders and everything in
Mm,
there. But I think what was super interesting that you just talked about was that besides mineralization pathfinders, you're also using the geochemistry to detect specific rock types that you think are interesting and specific alteration patterns, and using not just elements as single entities, but using
mm.
them as indices or using them as different ratios that maybe not so much in the Greenstone Bible, but have been published since then that can be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I've run a few courses again over my time as consulting in conjunction with other people, and usually around conferences, but sometimes in-house as well with clients. Basically, show people this whole workflow of how we build up the entire geochem interpretation for an area at whatever scale they're working at. It could be working at a scale where you've got 150, 200,000 lake sediment samples over a large area, a huge area, or thousands of kilometers by thousands of kilometers. Or it could be that we have a soil grid that's 2,000 samples and just looking for a drill targeting. So the thing is with the workflow, it's the same insofar as we first of all try and build up what's the lithology framework, okay, for this area, and then build on top of that, okay, lithology or lithogeochemical group by lithogeochemical group, what are the dominant alteration? And then once you have the litho and the alteration model to hang everything on, then that's when I start pegging on things like iron sulfur ratios. And then that's when we start pegging on things like pathfinder elements, such as in these deposits, could be bismuth, for example, arsenic, obviously, it's always a big one, gold silver ratio, for example, and things like this, and other elements, tellurium, molybdenum, uranium, things like that, trace elements that might be associated with the mineralization. So we only look at those obvious, if you like, elements once we've already got the geochemical framework built up from a lithological perspective, and then and then with the alteration on top. And don't forget that if you think about the other, especially with the Carlin discussion that we had when we talk about classification of marine sediments using the redox sensitive trace elements and things like that, those ratios can see through an awful lot of geological history. In the Carlin systems, it's in Nevada, it's Devonian, Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian rocks that are mineralized, and we can pinpoint their facies changes even now, 500 million years later. But actually, I think and I've used these same ratios in much older basins. For example, in the Finnish basins that are 2 to 2.4 GA in age, and these ratios are still present in the rocks. And I think that these redox sensitive trace elements can be used to distinguish facies changes basically in marine sediments that were formed anytime from the great oxygenation event till the present day. So that opens up the window for applying this type of analysis all the way back to 2.4 GA on the sedimentary basis. Now, of course, in the igneous rocks or the volcanic rocks, we already have all of these classifications that we all learned back at school, the ternary diagrams, where the tholeiitic rocks plot on an iron, calcium, magnesium diagram, for example, and other things. So build up your framework, your geochemistry, start with the litho, put alteration on top, put the pathfinders on top, and then see where your gold sits in all of
Sounds like a fun day at work, almost a party. That's what it sounds like. When are you personally excited about a greenstone project? When do you think is time to, okay, I think we really got something here?
Like I say, I like to build up the entire story now. So that's how I'm trying to get across is how the geochemistry can contribute to all of that
Mm.
overall framework. And if you think or play back some of the things I just mentioned, okay, hang on, I thought you were just going to show us where the arsenic anomalies were that
Yeah.
have a little bit of gold here and there. Or I thought you just play around with the gold-silver ratio a little bit or something. But the thing is that when then, of course, we're using this workflow, going through this workflow, you start seeing telltale signs, and then it feeds into the rest of the prospectivity analysis. For example, from a lithological point of view, but we do like to see where, for example, might be a rheological contrast. So that is where you see basically harder rocks up against softer rocks, notwithstanding the structure that put it there, whether it's a recumbent fold, whether it's a shear zone or a fault that's juxtaposed these two lithological types. You don't see that with the geochemistry. All you'll see if you're plotting things downhole, you see a whole bunch of samples that look like tholeiitic basalt, and then next minute it flips to, oh my gosh, here's a dolomite or a dolomitic marine sediment, okay, right up against it. Now, for whatever structural or whatever context that those two rocks are next to each other, then you start thinking, hang on, we've got our rheological contrasts in this rock package. Okay, and that's one thing that is exciting and adds a lot of points to the scoring. Okay, and as the story builds up, and then of course you'll see maybe pervasive in a textural perspective, but aerial extensive or pervasive around these sorts of contacts and potential structures, you start seeing your alteration. Okay, and then when you put that on top of it, and then the sulfide chemistry as well, or the sulfide geochemistry. So as all of these layers build up, it gets more and more exciting. And by the time, honestly, by the time you start switching on the gold and arsenic and silver and things like that, it's almost, yep.
I knew it.
Yeah. Yeah. So probably flicker of excitement would be when there's a really well-constrained data set comes across the SharePoint or something, or and because you know that if there's you can add a lot of value using that data set, and more often than not, yeah, you can just build a really cute story.
Love that. I'm like entranced sitting here. I'm like, tell me about your best day at the office. So
Yeah.
look, I think to finish this out, I would say returning to initially what we were talking about with the Greenstone Bible, I think something interesting to take away from this is that have you really learned anything life altering in terms of greenstone gold exploration with geochemistry since first reading the Greenstone Bible?
Yeah, it's a tough question because one thing I realized actually it's probably a few years ago, like only sort of 5 or 6 years ago, is that I can't remember what I learned from a book or what I learned from
Yeah.
school and what I learned somewhere from a mentor of mine or by giving a course with another collaborator or with someone who asked a question in the course. It's hard to pinpoint where and when you learn things, but I think one of the things to do is try and just take away mental notes of your experiences as you go through. And whenever you get a chance to get into the field, look at the rocks, look at the outcrops, look at the field relationships. If they're not there, if there's not much outcrop, then you get yourself into the core shed and talk to the local geologists and see what they've seen. And really have discussions with people about things. In terms of any key aspect, I think it's quite hard to put a finger on one thing, to be honest. But good data sets, and probably most of your guests will say the same thing, or probably have said something similar. Once you have those well-constrained data, then you really are off to the races. And yeah, just saving money at the lab or saving money on trying to get the maximum number of samples per day by just bagging dirt is not the way to set up a well-constrained database. And so it's not the best way to get full value and full impact from your geochem programs. Yeah, it's a bit of a generic statement, but
Sometimes though,
yeah.
when the shoe fits. Look, so I want to thank you so much for being here, Simon. And I hope that even though we had a little trouble figuring out how to frame this one, that you enjoyed your time being here with us to talk about greenstone golds. I want to thank everyone for listening to Geochemistry, and a big thanks to Simon Griffiths for humoring us for this annual installment of being on the show, dishing some great tea and putting geochemistry back into context for us. Thanks to our sponsor, LKI Consulting, and to It's Water and Coma Media for our music. And I'm looking forward to chatting with everybody next month.